Recently, I was invited to check out the new first person open world RPG, Tainted Grail Fall of Avalon, which many are calling indie dark Skyrim. Now, that's because Tainted Grail combines a lot of traditional open world RPG elements, like the character progression, exploration, and combat styles of games like Skyrim, Oblivion, or more recently, Obsidian Software's Avowed, with some very dark themes, more reminiscent of like Diablo or Elden Ring, while being developed and published by Awaken Realms, a somewhat less well known studio from Poland, who are actually more known for doing board games than video games. And while I initially had some reservations about jumping into a new open world RPG like this, once I did, I was actually pretty surprised with the world building, the combat, and the customization options here in Tainted Grail, and especially the exploration and the moment-to-moment gameplay, which was actually quite impressive. So these are going to be my impressions so far with the game after about 25 hours played. So Tainted Grail begins as any good RPG does, with you being locked up in prison and escaping due to some unforeseen twist of fate. So if you've played any Bethesda RPG, you know exactly what type of setup I'm talking about here, as this initially feels very much like an Elder Scrolls style prologue. Quickly though, things take a sudden turn when you figure out that your captors all wear matching red robes and have a weird thing for body horror style experimentation on their prisoners. But lucky for you, you quickly get rescued and you fight your way out and experience several basic game systems, from combat to lockpicking, crafting potions to dialogue and quests. The prologue is actually quite meaty, pun intended here maybe, but it takes a few hours. And by the end, I felt pretty good about how the game was teaching me how to play, while also introducing lore and mechanics in a way that actually felt natural, just through, normal gameplay and exploration. But for example, one of the first potions you can learn how to make is described in the journal written by the prison alchemist. Now, I also liked how there were multiple paths to success here, even in the prologue. For example, you can sneak around and go fully undetected, avoiding combat, or you can use tools to break through walls to take a completely different route. Combat at this point is actually pretty difficult as well, even on standard difficulty, so the game encourages experimentation to overcome those challenges. But like I said, the intro for Fall of Avalon is pretty dark, which sets the tone well for the rest of the open world adventure to come. You'll also be introduced to the game's overarching story here, which is, let's say, a dark version of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, though with several unique elements. And eventually you'll meet up with a certain spirit companion as well, and have your first interaction with the game's campfire or bonfire mechanic, essentially, which makes the game's progression feel a little bit Dark Souls or Elden Ring influenced, but in a good way. It does actually fit here with the world, and it feels like the perfect place to rest momentarily and level up. Bonfires do not reset enemies, by the way, in Tainted Grail, but they do serve as your primary way to, boost your attributes, unlock skill progression, and actually advance the overarching story by speaking to that spirit guide, for lack of a better term. No spoilers here, but it does feel very similar to Elden Ring, again, in a good way. You can also fast travel from these camps. You can identify hidden items and also recharge any special powers. But once you escape the prison in Fall of Avalon, the game completely shifts focus. You'll of course be introduced to the main quest and be given a destination to continue it should you choose to do so. That's the first town called Horns of the South, but you're by no means required to go there right away. Now, this is honestly where the magic really started to happen for me, because there's just a huge variety of other things I could do right away that simply stole away my attention from the main story quest. This is essentially that prison step out moment from Oblivion, literally, but also in spirit. You don't have to start the main quest. You can go do anything that you want with very little restriction from this point on. For example, as soon as I exited the prison and looked to my left, I saw a small bay with zombies that just begged me to level up my one-handed weapon skill with some combat. Of course, while I was there, I discovered some locked chests which contained treasure, and also came across a mysterious merchant who had some actually good items to sell to me that I needed to save up for in the future. A bit further in, I came across a small lake filled with blood instead of water, with some statues and carvings that I investigated for more tidbits of lore and story. And yes, you can and should dive underwater everywhere in this game, because there are underwater passages, chests, and bodies to loot. I came across bandit camps filled with enemies to fight, more shrines that actually gave me specific stat boosts for specific offerings, and a huge ogre mini boss that wiped the floor with me, but I would later return to defeat once I became more powerful. I also found at least 3 full dungeons as well. All of these, of course, are optional and have multiple pathways, treasure chests, and plenty of enemies to defeat. These dungeons are kind of along the lines of like an Oblivion or a Skyrim dungeon, a separate instance that you zone into, maybe spend 20, 30 minutes exploring it, and then just come out, absolutely loaded down with treasure and equipment that you're going to need to sell. But before I knew it, I hadn't progressed the main quest at all, but night had already fallen, and nighttime in Tainted Grail is actually pretty unique. Won't spoil it for you here because it caught me completely by surprise in a good way, but let's just say you better be ready for combat, or at least be prepared to run away very quickly, because believe me, it's tough, especially early on, but it also adds a real sense of danger and this element of mystery that contributes to that overall dark vibe in Tainted Grail. But all of this activity happened in probably the first 2 hours of my main quest journey. Like I said, I got so distracted that the main quest was basically a distant memory at that point. I was just living in the world of Avalon and loving every minute of it. But in terms of quests, there is that main storyline and then plenty of side content and side quests. One of the most impressive things here is that every line of dialogue in Tainted Grail is fully voice acted, most of it done surprisingly well. Characters have voices and accents appropriate to the game's dark fantasy setting, and there's actually a crazy amount of dialogue and side quests in this game to enjoy. I remember, for example, when I got to that first main city, Horns of the South, it felt really alive with lots of NPCs and dialogues, which was unexpected from, like a AA publisher or like an indie style game. In fact, most of the NPCs that you come across have totally unique things to say to you and many unique quests as well. I didn't come across a single guard who had like a default hello citizen dialogue line. Every single one was unique. Even random guards, which I came across, guarding the top of the city wall, completely away from everyone else in the main town, all had unique dialogue, and most of them even had their own quests, which I could complete for unique rewards like consumables, gear, or even crafting recipes. I definitely did not expect this level of detail, but like I said, this was the first city, so things could change, but this was a nice surprise for sure. But while exploration, discovery, and quests certainly is the main focus here, you'll be spending a lot of time in combat. So combat is a big part of Tainted Grail as well. This game uses a dual hand system, basically, Skyrim or Avowed style, where you can mix and match between your left and right hand items, choosing from a variety of weapons, ranged weapons, defensive options, melee, and of course spells, which can go into either slot. And now in terms of weapons, you'll come across all the usual suspects from swords to axes, maces, daggers, spears, and so on, with some, two-handed varieties like mauls and greatswords. So you'll only be able to equip one of those using both hands. For ranged weapons, you have two-handed options there as well, like bows, of course. And then there are some consumable weapons like throwing knives, for example. But then you have multiple spells also from different schools or different types of magic that you can equip on your character as well. Interesting, these are actually found as lootable items around the world, and they often come in chests at the end of those like optional dungeons. These come in a variety of different elements like you would expect, fire, ice, and so on, as well as healing and defensive spells, and even summoning creatures and combat NPCs, which seems to be very powerful. Now, the actual combat itself includes you mixing light and heavy attacks with the melee, ranged, and spells, all having light and heavy variations of them. For melee weapons, for example, light attacks do less damage, but are faster and consume less stamina, while heavy melee attacks take longer to queue up and consume more stamina, but will also deal more damage once you land those. Spells have an even more interesting interaction with light and heavy attacks, or essentially basic and charged attacks. For example, the first drain spell, which you can get early on, applies a bleed effect to your target with its basic cast, but if you hold down the cast button, the spell now drains enemy health and heals you back as like a channeled effect. And actually, most spells in the game have some type of interaction like this, with a basic attack for less mana, and then a charged or channeled effect, which costs more but also may be more effective or have just different interactions. As far as defensive mechanics go, you've got dashing, which can be done in all directions and has a very generous distance tied to it. This will actually be your main form of avoiding damage early on. It's pretty effective once you get the timing down, and it does make combat feel pretty fast-paced and chaotic. You can also block or parry if you prefer the stand your ground style of combat, which is another great approach. But just keep in mind that both your offensive and defensive abilities are going to make use of your stamina bar. So stamina management, of course, is a big part of combat as well. And what I also liked about Tainted Grail was how it set up basically 4 different combat loadouts with a quick swap menu. So I use this in my case to swap between one-handed spell, different spells, and maybe a more powerful two-handed weapon, and then a ranged weapon like a bow. And you have all 4 of those on your quick slot, and you can just swap between those loadouts at will. But once you've defeated enough enemies or completed enough quests or discovered enough locations, you'll eventually earn enough experience to level up and progress your character further. Progressing skills in Tainted Grail does feel very much like an Elder Scrolls game, which is more proficiency based. So basically, the more you use a skill, the more it levels up. And this also gives you experience, which contributes then to your next character level. So for example, when you travel between locations, you can sprint and jump all along the way to level up your athletic skill. Most weapon types have their own skill progression, and there's also skill progression for magic spells, and so on. But once your character has gained enough overall experience, you'll also get a character level up, where then you can boost an attribute as well as contribute a skill point to many different skill trees. Tainted Grail includes 6 different attributes. Right now, you start at level 1 for each of these when you start the game, and then as you level up, you'll be able to put 1 point into one of those attributes, spending them however you want. So we have strength, which is going to be melee damage, stamina, and armor weight, or basically carry weight. You have endurance, which is going to improve your health, your encumbrance, and stamina regeneration. Dexterity improves attack speed, stealth, and range damage. Spirituality improves your spell power, max mana, as well as mana regeneration. Practicality is going to focus on crafting, weak spot damage, as well as cost reduction and bartering. And perception is going to improve critical damage, critical chance, as well as sneak attack damage. And keep in mind that your attributes not only improve your character's performance, but they also tie into requirements for weapons, armor, and spells. Now, this is extremely important because without enough strength or dexterity, usually in the case of weapons, or endurance for heavy armor, or spirituality for some spells, you either won't be able to equip them, or you might be able to equip them, but your damage will be lower, and any special effects, for example, on that weapon won't be usable. So stat checks is going to be a big part of this, definitely something to keep in mind when you're progressing your character. But attributes is not the only progression available to customize your build in Tainted Grail. Each attribute class also has its own set of skill trees, which you can freely customize as well. You're going to get 1 skill point essentially to spend here every time you level up. This is separate from the point that you get to increase the attributes themselves. And there are many, many skill trees here, which are focus on a variety of different play styles. Basically what you would expect from a fantasy RPG, like one-handed weapons, for example, or long-range weapons, armor, healing, or different, magic types. One of my favorite skill trees so far has been the one that focuses on those summoning spells, where I can make my summoned creatures stronger, I can give them more health or more damage. I can also increase my own damage and magical regeneration while my summoned pets are active. And that's just one of, several different trees which you can customize in this game. There's also multiple crafting options, obviously, to help you further flesh out your build. That's including things like alchemy, cooking, and weapons and armor creation. I mentioned this earlier, but I really like how crafting recipes are usually integrated naturally just into the gameplay by talking to NPCs or completing quests, reading a recipe in a drawer or something like that. But crafting potions and food is definitely something you must do early on, as you'll need the potions for healing. Plus, food can give your character some useful combat buffs. Now, I just started crafting my own armor sets as well, which often have unique themes and effects, like this one set, which replicates the look of a local monster type and requires skins and bones from that monster as components in order to craft it. And then you'll get specific bonuses on that as well, like this one gives you, more dexterity or more endurance, for example. So far, I've talked about many of the positives I came across in Tainted Grail Fall of Avalon, which there are many. If it's not obvious already, I do like this game a lot, but it's also not perfect. Of course, in terms of exploration, I did feel somewhat limited at times, especially when it came to verticality. I think what I missed the most here was just some type of climbing or vault up mechanic that would help me traverse the environment a little bit quicker. This is what Avowed did extremely well. It made accessing vertical areas so much easier, and I think it also let the developers place chests and quest items in much more interesting locations. So something like that in this game would have been greatly appreciated. Now, in terms of combat, I think the melee weapons did feel good here, while the bow just didn't have the same type of impact to it, where I felt like I was doing solid damage or staggering enemies, and enemies would actually react to it. So some of the range playstyles I think do need a little bit of work. Speaking of which, I understand why weapons, armor, and even spells have stat requirements in RPGs. I mean, it does make sense, but it also does feel bad, especially early on when you get an awesome piece of loot and you just don't have enough stats to get the bonus effect that it provides. This doesn't seem to match the total freedom that the game was going for, particularly because you can't switch or reset your attributes very easily in this game, though it is possible. Technically, there are attribute respec potions that are kind of rare, but they do exist. But basically, it feels like you'll want to do a bit of research into builds and item sets in this game, so you're not fully locked out of the best gear at high levels because of how you progressed your character. But we'll definitely need to wait and see a bit for that one. Finally, and this is not a bad thing necessarily, the character models and particularly facial animations during dialogue do feel a bit out of date when compared to other modern games. It is important to keep in mind that this is not from a AAA studio, and I do think that the team did do a good job of matching art style and visual themes throughout, and they also did a good job of hiding those facial animations because the camera pulls out a little bit during dialogues. But if you're expecting really tight, camera angles for dialogues and expressive, emotional animations, you're just not going to get that from an indie studio like this, where they only have so much time and money to invest. So, of course, there's going to be things here and there which stick out and aren't the most polished. So things like character models and facial animations definitely fall into that category. But when I was playing, I was so, into the game that I honestly didn't really notice. The moment-to-moment gameplay does an amazing job of just bringing you into this world and making you live in it. So when it comes down to it, I definitely recommend Tainted Grail, especially if you're a fan of this style of game, whether it's Skyrim, Oblivion, or even now a game like Avowed. Tainted Grail Fall of Avalon has been expertly crafted with the best features of those style of games, with an entirely new world to explore, a new cast of characters, new types of magic, new armor sets, new enemies and bosses, and with a price point, I believe, of under $50. And at least 100 hours of gameplay from what I've experienced so far for a full playthrough, this is a game that's well worth picking up. That's going to do it for my impressions on Tainted Grail Fall of Avalon. Let me know in the comments what you think of this game, if you've been playing as well, if you like it or not, and does it scratch that itch for the next open world RPG. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you're doing well. Stay safe out there, and I will see you around in the next video.